I'm a professional part-time working mom, and I have been for over 5 years, since our older son was born. And I cut my teeth in the advertising business in New York City, working on huge pieces of business at large global marketing agencies. It was exciting, it was fun, it was fast-paced, we worked crazy hours. And most of my colleagues were young and single like me, or they were married and they didn't have kids yet. And what I noticed pretty quickly was that the moms who had, the women who had families didn't necessarily go home any earlier than the rest of us. And when they did, they ended up working for hours just to catch up. And so I figured out pretty quickly I wasn't on track for the lifestyle that I wanted in the long term. And I didn't have a really good model for having both career and family in this full-time work environment that I was in. And so I think that was really the first time that I started thinking about the concept of being a full-time mom and a part-time professional. Because I had worked really hard on my career, and so I didn't want to give it up. But I also really wanted to have a family, and I wanted to be engaged in the lives of my children. So fast forward more than a decade, and after business school, I found myself yet again working for a marketing agency, and I was there for about 6.5 years. And after about a year after our older son was born, I walked away from the corporate world, and I focused on my own business, where I could work part-time, and I could be the full-time mom that I really wanted to be. And about 3 years ago, I was having coffee with a friend, and we said, where are all the success stories of professional part-time working moms? And so I searched. And I might have found a blurb here or there, but really, they were like unicorns. And it's really interesting because so many moms want this professional type they want this kind of approach to their career, but I couldn't find their stories. And so, and it's interesting because you can find stories on the mommy wars between stay-at-home moms and full-time moms, between moms who have opted out and moms who lean in. You can find information on moms who have opted out and are trying to opt back in. You can find these stories, you can find this information everywhere. But what about professional part-time working moms? Are you one? Do you know one? Do you manage one? Is your sister, mom, neighbor, daughter a professional part-time working mom? Where's her story? These moms, they want to stay active in their careers. They're like me. They want to stay engaged in their careers, and they want to be involved in the lives of their children. But you don't hear their stories, and that's what needs to change. And so, since I couldn't find the narrative that I was looking for, I decided that I was going to go and find these moms. I wanted to know their advice, their insights, their stories, so that other moms could learn from what they were experiencing. And so I went out one by one to what eventually became 110 professional part-time working moms so that I could share their stories. And a professional part-time working mom, what is the definition? She's a mom who's still very active in her career, but she works fewer hours than her colleagues or the industry norm. And I talked to moms who worked as few as 10 and moms who worked 40. But if you compare them to their colleagues who are working more than 60, 40 is part-time. I see people shaking their heads. And there's a lot going on in the world today that makes this a very timely conversation. And if you look at what's going on in the US specifically, there are about 6 major shifts if you look holistically. I'm going to talk about 3. I want to start with talking about population. Right now, moms have less than 2 children, and we need moms to have more than 2, or we need immigrants to fill the gap. And if they don't fill the gap, then our population will naturally shrink. And so if you want to see the extreme of this kind of situation, you can look at countries like Germany and Japan, whose populations are estimated to shrink by about 10% in the next 30 or so years. By some estimates, Japan, and this is a graph for Japan, actually their population shrinks by about 1 million people each year. And in the interviews that I did, the vast majority of moms did have 2 or more children. And that sense of overwhelm happened with the second. And moms started working part-time for so many different reasons. A sick family member, some moms shared that they were on the verge of divorce because it was just all too much. And then some moms simply wanted to spend more time or needed to spend more time with their children. And so if that sense of overwhelm happens with two, and we need moms to stay in the workforce, how do we encourage them to have more babies, to keep growing our population? Another interesting shift is that educated women are having babies later in life. And so in the US, about 40% of women with bachelor's and about 54% of women with master's degrees are waiting until about 30 to have their first child. And that's about 4 years older than the national average. One of the moms I talked to was, she's an OBGYN who works in Austin, Texas. She works about 30 to 40 hours a week in comparison to her colleagues who work 60. And fascinating interview, one of her key pieces of advice was not to wait. Because she talked about women can get their careers on track or they can keep their careers on track, but women can't always have babies. And so her whole approach to life was think about career and family at the same time instead of reaching your career goals and then thinking about family. Another shift is that baby boomers are turning retirement age. So here's a scary statistic. Every day, 10,000 baby boomers turn retirement age, and that's going to continue for the next 13 or so years. So every day, 10,000 baby boomers can walk out the door. It's unlikely because they're not all ready for retirement and they don't all want to retire. But if they did, think about the fact that we don't have enough people to fill all their roles, and think about the institutional memory that could walk out the door with them, that American business would lose. And who's going to take care of this aging population? Moms are already being squeezed between careers and taking care of their own families. So how are we going to add taking care of aging family members into the mix? How's that going to work? Are moms going to be more likely to leave the workforce? Another of the moms that I interviewed lives in Atlanta. She works about 10 to 15 hours. She's an education consultant. And she's also getting her PhD. Pretty amazing. And she and her husband recently purchased a home, and it's big enough for their family of 4 and her parents and her in-laws to move in. And so she realizes that she's going to be taking care of both sets of parents over the long term. And so she's setting herself up for success now to have professional fulfillment and to have work-life balance, because in the long run, she wants to be a part-time professor. Another of the major shifts, and the final shift for population, is millennials. This is the generation born in the 1980s to about 2000. They have a very different approach to career because they focus on work-life balance from the beginning, not necessarily because of their family obligations. And they want more of that work-life balance. In fact, 95% talk about it being important, 70% talk about it being very important. And their perspective is more of work-life integration. So they actually blend work and life together instead of trying to balance the two. And they want to enjoy their lives, not work for decades and then start enjoying their lives. One of the moms I spoke to several millennial moms, but one of them was a millennial. And her story was very different in that she worked for several years. She was in the workforce for several years. And then she resigned so that she and her husband could go and travel in South America for 5.5 months. And what was so interesting is she came back, and instead of going back into the workforce, she started an Etsy shop making jewelry so that she could have that flexibility built in up front instead of working really hard and then pulling back once it was time to have kids. So we've talked about the whole impact of population. I want to talk a little bit about the social impact. So the million-dollar question in all of this is, are part-time working moms happier? It turns out they are happier than full-time working moms and stay-at-home moms. They're able to take that juggling act in stride, and they also spend the right amount of time with their children and their significant other. So not too little and not too much. For those of you who have daughters, this one is for you. So a worldwide study was done of 13,000 women, and they found that those daughters of moms who worked were more likely to work, have a higher wage, and actually have supervisory roles than those daughters of moms who were stay-at-home. It's important to think about the business and the economic perspective in all of this. So I want to start by talking about productivity. So this 40-hour work week that we use in the US is, it became popular in like the 1920s, and it's often linked to Henry Ford. And he didn't necessarily come up with it, but he certainly made it popular. And so almost 100 years later, we make and do all sorts of new things, but that 40-hour work week is still our standard. And so on a daily basis, this is what we're measured by, this productivity, instead of productivity. So it's hours in the office, and recent studies show that there's a cap on productivity at about 25 or 30 hours. So why do we measure people every day on number of hours in the office instead of productivity or contribution? Why is that? There's also a skills gap. Companies in the US, about 60% of them, actually don't have enough employees to do all of the work that they have. And so about 25% of companies actually feel the financial impact of this employee gap. So baby boomers are starting to leave. Women are having babies later, and they're not necessarily coming back to the workforce. So isn't this all just going to make an existing problem worse? What if we think about it differently? What if companies say, I'm just going to find somebody new? Think about the cost of finding, training, and everything else to get an employee up to speed. Is it really worth it? The final thing that I want to talk about is the impact of having women in the upper echelon of a company. A global study was done of 22,000 global publicly traded companies, and they found that having women in the top 30% actually increased net profit margin by 6%. That can be pretty amazing in a competitive environment. So I've talked about a lot of different aspects, and I've talked about it with this professional part-time work opportunity as it relates to moms. But in reality, it has all kinds of applications. Dads, millennials, baby boomers who want to partially retire. So I choose to talk about moms because that's my lens. It's my reality every day. But there are so many other applications, and we could actually pair people so that we have institutional memory flow from one person to the other instead of out the door. So I'm going to leave you with these final thoughts and a challenge. It's the right time to start talking about and actually creating more professional part-time work opportunities for moms. And once we start those conversations and actually start creating those kinds of opportunities, we need to start sharing those success stories so that moms and women can learn from and actually build on these. It's time.